Well, now that we have looked at length once again at perceptions of the frontier and the birth of the myth of the frontier, because that's really what we're seeing at this point in time, let's now take a look at the realities of the Western frontiers after the Louisiana Purchase as this market revolution is getting geared up. So, we're going to take a brief general overview, and then what we're going to do is we're going to kind of travel around the map and look at various different points of frontier as U.S. boundaries continue to expand westward.
All right, then, here we go with a brief history of the Western frontier. Now, as you are aware, in the early colonial period, this was the Western frontier, west of the boundaries of the 13 English colonies, west of the Appalachian Mountain chain, that area that colonists wanted to settle, but the British government wouldn't let them, at least not legally. But as of 1783, with the defeat of the British in the American Revolution, all that area becomes part of the United States, effectively doubling the size of what had been 13 original states. All right, so that's where we are as of 1800 or so. Then, of course, 1803, we see the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France under the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, which again doubles the size of the United States. Now, once the Louisiana Purchase is made, the Corps of Discovery, led by Lewis and Clark, make that journey to to explore the area that's been gained, but to do more than that, to push on to the Pacific Northwest, to the Pacific Ocean, specifically to Oregon Territory. And during this time, part of that expedition was this guy, who was a scout for the Lewis and Clark expedition. His name was John Coulter, a frontiersman who traveled all the way to Oregon with the Corps of Discovery, but liked it so much out west that he decided to stay there. And so they kind of dropped him off in the Rocky Mountains, and he went into the fur trade, which quite a few French Canadians had drifted southward into the Rocky Mountains and had participated in. And some British farther to the north and west had done. But this made John Coulter the first English-speaking person and the first American to be part of the Colorado Rockies fur trade, the first of what would come to be called the Mountain Men. All right, so these were those individuals who lived usually among the Indians and who adopted a lot of Native American styles of dress and of life. John Coulter, in particular, is a noteworthy guy. Not just because he was the first mountain man, but for a couple of things that happened to him. For one thing, there was an occasion when he was captured, I think by Blackfoot, maybe it was by Arikara. Anyway, he was captured by Indians and stripped naked and forced to what was called run the gauntlet, where he had to kind of like a square dance when you go down through the two rows of people down the middle, except in this case the people are beating you with sticks and clubs and axes in some cases. And if you make it through the end of the line, they give you a little bit of a head start because they are sporting, and then they come after you on ponies. So Coulter made it through the line, and when the Indians pursued him, he managed to get a lance away from one of them and kill him. And in fact, I think he killed two or three, and he got away and set off naked across the prairie to walk back to the the United States and quote-unquote civilization. And along the way, he passed through this area that he noticed the ground rumbled and shook, and then huge jets of steam came pouring up out of the ground. Very frightening. Never seen anything like it. And like any reasonable person, he concluded that he had found the entrance to the gates of hell. And so when he did finally make it back, hopefully getting some clothes along the way, making something for himself, he said, "I have been to hell and back," literally. And he told everybody about what he had seen, and no one believed him. They thought it was a delusion. And so for a long time, it was a joke. Coulter's Hell, out there somewhere around Montana or Wyoming. But a few decades later, the joke was on everybody else, because later Americans made it into the area and realized that that was the geysers at Yellowstone. Anyway, mountain men, a rough and hardy breed. Well, all that stuff about Lewis and Clark going to Oregon. Oregon was not part of the Louisiana Purchase at all. It was claimed by Great Britain. Now, after the War of 1812, there was sort of, during the treaty negotiations for that, it was kind of up in the air as to who's going to control the Oregon Territory, the U.S. or Great Britain. They both had a claim on it. Now, the Oregon Territory actually extended about twice as far up into Canada as present-day Oregon and Washington. So the British technically had the claim. That's why Thomas Jefferson had sent Lewis and Clark to Oregon, so that if they made a claim on it later, they would have some basis for saying that a government-sponsored group had been there and had been active in the area. Well, the British didn't want to settle in Oregon. They wanted to participate in the fur trade with the Native Americans in the region, so they had a handful of forts up there and trading posts, but mostly they were concerned with the fur trade. However, eventually, some of those mountain men who became familiar with the area started to lead travelers from the U.S., settlers from the U.S., across the Rockies, way up there, and to Oregon Territory. Starting to do that in the early 1840s. And after a couple of wagon trains had made their way along this new trail that was being blazed out by the scouts, with enough wagons rolling through, it kind of made a bit of a trail that others could follow. They'd cut down the underbrush and so forth. So once a couple of people had done it, then it was a lot easier to do. So large numbers of people started following that Oregon Trail by the mid-1840s into Oregon Territory to settle there, not to participate in the fur trade, but to go there and establish homesteads. Now, at this time, it is still in dispute as to who controls it. There's kind of a joint, the U.S. and Great Britain kind of had joint custody of it, but both of them wanted sole custody. I guess you could look at it that way. So that was the Oregon Trail. As there was more desire to expand westward, a situation occurred in Texas in the 1820s, where quite a few Americans were actually invited by the Mexican government to come settle in the Mexican state of Tejas, or Texas, primarily to serve as buffers against the Comanches. But those settlers, those Anglo settlers, wanted to go there because they're in the Red River Valley especially, really, really good for growing cotton And by the 1820s, cotton was a huge, huge thing. So, as you probably know, there was a revolution among, well, both the Anglo settlers and some of the Mexicans who lived in the area that allied with them to establish Texas as an independent country, declaring its independence from Mexico, which led to a war, and eventually the citizens of the new Republic of Texas, many of them were appealing to the United States to annex their country of Texas and make it a state. And then eventually that was done. Now the claims of Texas for what its borders were a lot bigger than the borders of the present-day state of Texas. So Texas was annexed by the U.S. 1845. The next year, 1846, saw the new president coming into office, James K. Polk, who had promised that he was going to get a lot of territory from Mexico, and that he was going to settle the question about Oregon. Essentially, that he was going to expand westward significantly. Now, in Oregon, as I said, the territory extended quite a bit northward into Canada. So there in the upper left, that's the Oregon country. And here you can see the present-day border between the U.S. and Canada. Now, many Southern Americans, many Southern Democrats, in fact, wanted to get the Oregon Territory, and they wanted all of it. They didn't want to cut it off where the border is now. They wanted to extend all the way to the northernmost border, way up into Canada, the 54-40 parallel, and so that became kind of a slogan for those people. 54-40 or fight. In other words, if Britain doesn't give us all of Oregon, we'll go to war with them. Now, at the same time, war was gearing up between the U.S. and Mexico on essentially some very, very, very flimsy pretexts, and that did erupt into war in 1846. A very unpopular war in the northern states, and very popular in the southern states. Northern states believed that the whole thing was a land grab by southern states so that they could continue to expand cotton agriculture and slavery further west below that line of freedom and slavery established by the Compromise of 1820. The British and the U.S. kind of made a deal. They made a compromise and split Oregon in half. So the U.S. got the southern part, and Britain got the northern part of what had been called the Oregon country. Remember, Polk hadn't promised he'd get it all. He promised he was going to settle it, and he did settle it. Meanwhile, the war with Mexico, which lasted a couple of years, leading eventually to a treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, that led to this huge area being taken from Mexico and gained instead by the United States. Well, kind of looking back again at that situation in Oregon, in 1851, there was another significant treaty, this one with several Native American tribes, about 8 or so, tribes of the northern plains. Now, the issue was the Oregon Trail, which went right through Indian Territory and was very disruptive. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people in wagons traveling through the hunting grounds, essentially the buffalo herds of these several tribes and that's very destructive. So all these settlers would come through, and they got to eat, right? So I mean, game became scarce for the Indians, and there were just lots of opportunities for friction between the two groups. And so the U.S. met with the tribes, drew up a treaty, Fort Laramie, Wyoming, that essentially required the tribes to give passage, to give access to all these settlers passing through, to allow them to pass through, and even allow the U.S. Army to build forts to protect them if necessary. But in return, that whole area in blue right there was to be set aside as Indian country, as Indian land that would not be claimed by the United States. So that treaty was reached, and everything was peaceful for about 10 years, and everybody was happy until, until gold was discovered about a decade later. All right. Well, as you are aware, eventually, 1849, gold was discovered in California, which was part of that area that had just been taken the previous year away from Mexico, right? So gold is discovered, huge numbers of people come pouring in there, and California becomes a really big western frontier, very heavily populated, particularly Northern California around San Francisco. San Francisco just exploded overnight into a huge, huge city. And we're going to talk more about the gold rush and some aspects of that in just a little bit. That was 1849. Then finally, the Gadsden Purchase, which you may have never heard of. It pertains to this little strip of land here along the U.S.-Mexican border, which the U.S. persuaded Mexico to sell in 1853, leading to that expanded border that we now have. And there you have it, the complete history of westward expansion in 15 minutes. I impressed even myself with that. Now, if you will notice, the Louisiana Purchase was made in 1803, but the real push of westward expansion, so far as people actually moving west, wasn't until the 1840s. Now, there's various reasons for that, which a lot of which we have just discussed. In the 18-teens, 1820s, people were moving into Missouri, and which became a state in 1820, and Arkansas, but not getting deeper into the West until the Oregon Trail, unless you count the people who moved to Texas when it was part of Mexico. Now, this movement west that had such a huge impetus in the 1840s coincided with the high point of the market revolution. If you will recall the things we discussed about that, more people beginning to romanticize the western frontier, and people also beginning to romanticize the idea of being a self-made man, of being self-sufficient, of being independent, because of all the interdependence that people were experiencing because of the Industrial Revolution and the market revolution. And, that whole idea of complete independence was never completely accurate, because there always was still, a sense of community among people out on the frontier. Well, all this stuff kind of happening at the same time brings us to an expression that I'm sure you've heard before: manifest destiny. And this idea of manifest destiny was really starting to take hold in the 1840s. The expression itself was coined by a journalist in a newspaper editorial a journalist named John L. O'Sullivan, who wrote these words in 1845, quote, talking about the claim that the United States has on Western territories that they've not yet gained. Quote, and that claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us. So Providence, remember, is another word for God. So God has given us this continent, us being the United States, U.S. Why? To develop the experiment of liberty and federated self-government, which is to say, the federal form of government established in the Constitution. That's something O'Sullivan is saying, that God has given the United States as like a sacred mission to share, to spread out across the whole continent and to nurture and grow those concepts of liberty and self-government. Now, slight problem there. Other people were on that land who had the vague idea that they owned it, like Mexico, for instance, or the many Native American tribes. And those were obstacles to be swept away. That's what manifest destiny is all about, that those other people are doomed before progress, the progress of America, and they're just standing in the way and impeding that progress. Now, by the way, you've heard the term manifest destiny. What the heck does it actually mean? You have to kind of break it down a little bit. You know what destiny is, and O'Sullivan is saying that God laid out this destiny for the United States. Manifest means something is visible. Something has made itself visible. Like, if you ever watch any of the, and gosh, I hope you don't, but if you watch any of those ghost hunter, quote-unquote reality programs, they'll be running around in some allegedly haunted house looking for a manifestation of a ghost. That is, that it has become visible. So what manifest destiny means is it's our obvious destiny, the obvious will of God, that the government of the United States should spread across the entire continent, bringing liberty to people, as it turns out, whether they wanted it or not. All right, well, this was a new idea, but it kind of, in some ways, built on some older ideas, specifically the idea of American exceptionalism, which is the idea, not that America is good, but that America is completely unique and the best, the absolute best, and sort of favored, clearly and obviously favored by God, because everything about it's better than everybody else. That idea was first introduced to Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630 by the Puritan Governor John Winthrop, who said that the Pilgrim and Puritan colonies in Massachusetts were going to be like a shining city on a hill, a beacon to show God's glory in this case. And that, by the way, is a quote from Jesus, from the Gospels, where he said, let your faith be shining so that it can be visible from a great distance away, like a city on a hill. Later in 1776, Thomas Paine, in Common Sense, as he was laying out an argument as to why the colonies should break away from Great Britain and become an independent country, included the argument that the U.S. should be a country that was a beacon of liberty, a shining city on a hill, if you will, to the rest of the world to inspire them towards self-government and the overthrow of tyranny and so forth, which, is not a bad thing at all. However, if you take all that, if you combine Thomas Paine's usage of these terms, and then you combine that with the religious fervor of the Puritans, you wind up with this destiny that is preordained by God. And, well, that's a very Puritanic thing, that sort of Calvinistic preordination. And then you've got this idea that therefore God has commanded you to go out into these areas that the U.S. doesn't possess yet and take them for everyone's greater good. It's going to be better for them if we, the U.S., bring them enlightenment and civilization over the savagery that they have, whether they are Mexican or Native American, or, as it turns out, South American, Canadian, whatever. Now, this concept was very popular in the 1840s, like I said, with Southerners. Well, I guess I didn't say that, but what I did say was the Mexican War was popular with Southerners. That's because it was an expression of this. The Democratic Party was very powerful in the South. And the idea of expanding westward, ultimately, to further sustain Cotton as king, very popular in the South, very unpopular with Whigs. Polk was a Democratic president from Tennessee. The Whigs were the opposite party. And to the Whigs, this whole manifest destiny idea didn't sound like the obvious destiny of America at all. It actually sounded like treason to the ideals of what America was supposed to be. It sounded like treason to the ideals of Thomas Paine, because it abandoned the principles of republicanism, small r republicanism, which was the sort of the guiding philosophy of the founding fathers. This idea, not just that a republic doesn't have a king, but republicanism, the idea that a government without a monarch, a government of the people by the people, in which the greater good is always paramount, and in which virtue is paramount. That was the things that the Whigs believed the country was built on. And this whole idea of manifest destiny sounded like tossing that out the window and instead calling for right by conquest. Not might for right, but might is right, to paraphrase King Arthur, actually, in Camelot. So this was not universally accepted and held, but it was a very powerful philosophy that grew in power, that gained influence as the years went on, to the extent that it became the primary narrative that Americans envisioned themselves having, especially after the Civil War, and that would become the primary narrative used to describe American history in textbooks all the way into the 20th century, all the way to the end of the 20th century, and I think in many ways still into the 21st century when you're talking about K through 12 at least. This idea that this triumphalist narrative that America was destined for absolute greatness because of its inherent blessing by God, and so sweeping aside everybody else along the way isn't really that bad if you look at it in the context of it's what God clearly must want. And all this is summarized really well in this painting. The painting is called American Progress, and it was painted by John Gast in 1872. So this whole Manifest Destiny thing's really starting to get some power in the 1840s. I said that it increased really after the Civil War, so that ended in 1865. This painting, by the way, was displayed. Prints of this were displayed in bars and saloons all over the country during this time period. So the sort of thing you sit and drink your beer and look up at. So American Progress. American Progress is represented in this painting by this beautiful, fair-skinned and fair-haired lady, beautiful blonde lady in flowing robes, who is moving from right to left, from east to west. She is progress. American progress, American superiority, really, of American civilization. And you'll notice that behind her, it's all sunny, because that's where she's already been. And you'll notice that behind her you see trains, and you see in the lower right-hand corner farmers that are conquering of the land, and then right there at her feet stagecoaches heading west, and groups of pioneers heading west. But you'll also notice that in the west, you can see up in the upper left, you can see the Rocky Mountains up there. That in the west, everything is dark. It's dark, it's benighted, it's in shadow, it's mysterious. It has not yet been reached by the enlightenment of American civilization and progress. So, in that dark area, there are wild animals like buffalo, and you see some wolves there. You see some Indians that would count as wild animals to people looking at this picture at that time. And so as the fair-haired, golden-haired maiden of the West, or of America, travels westward, then the light is going to shine in those shadowy corners, and they too will become brightly lit and promising, and evidence of progress, and all the things standing in the way of progress, like wildlife or Native Americans, will be swept away. So, like I said, that perfectly encapsulates what the concept of manifest destiny is all about. Now, by the way, some of you may be familiar with this, probably most of you aren't. There was a TV series called Hell on Wheels. I think it was on for 6 or 7 years. Started in 2011 as a Western on AMC about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The reason I mention it now is because the first couple of seasons, they really played up and demonstrated this idea of the fair-haired maiden of the West. That's something that was, in fact, a plot point of the series, and it's a really good show. And of course, it's dramatized and it's fiction, but it is pretty good representation of the building of the railroad. Well, that's a summary of American Westward movement, and then a summary of the philosophy behind it, which is tied in really closely to the changes brought about, the social changes brought about by the market revolution. So, what we're going to do next is we're going to look at different areas of Western frontier and look at the arrival of American settlers and how that impacted the local environment.